They dragged the gravestones out of Silt Creek on a Tuesday, and Elias Croft watched from the ridge as the men he had once called neighbors used his dead wife's name to pry loose the contracts that bound him to his own land. The county assessor, a man named Phelps with clean fingernails and a voice like a gate hinge, stood on the porch of the land office reading aloud the dissolution of Plame. Elias heard every third word through the October wind. Abandonment of improvements, failure to render tax in kind, forfeiture effective upon the conclusion of harvest, which was a fine joke because they had waited until the wheat was cut and carted, until the root cellar was stocked and the jerky hung, and then they dissolved his claim on the land he had worked for 11 years. The land where his wife Ruth had died giving birth to their third child, the child who also died in the small hours of a March morning that smelled of iron and tallow. Elias was 43. He had been the township surveyor before he was a farmer, the man who walked property lines with a brass compass and a chain, the man who knew where every boundary pin was buried and every spring surfaced. He had mapped every quarter section within 20 miles of Harlow, Nebraska. He knew the land the way a surgeon knows a body, by what lay beneath the skin. They did not exile him for any crime. They exiled him because Phelps wanted his water rights, and because the new railroad spur needed a right-of-way through his South 40, and because a widower with 2 surviving children and no family connections was the easiest man in the township to erase. His daughter Nettie was 9. His son Theo was 6. They stood beside the wagon with everything they owned, while Phelps's men carried the last of the smoked pork out of the root cellar. The forfeiture included improvements and stores. Everything Elias had built and grown and preserved for winter now belonged to the Township Trust, which was to say, it belonged to Phelps. Margaret Scoville, who ran the dry goods counter and had once traded Ruth a bolt of calico for a dozen eggs every week for a year, stood at the edge of the crowd and said nothing. She held a handkerchief to her mouth as if she might be sick, but she said nothing. That was worse than the jeering. The jeering Elias could burn for fuel. Margaret's silence was just weather. Phelps walked over to the wagon. He had the decency to lower his voice, which made it worse. "Elias," he said, "there is no malice in this. The township needs the water. You can file a new claim north of the breaks if you want, but I would not recommend it. That ground has alkali in the topsoil, and nothing grows there but sage." Elias looked at his children. Nettie had her mother's jaw, set hard, teeth together. Theo was watching a beetle cross the wagon wheel rim with the absolute focus of a boy who has decided not to cry. "I mapped that ground," Elias said. "I know what is there." Phelps almost flinched, almost. There was a flicker behind his eyes. Something that might have been shame, but it passed through him like a bird's shadow crosses a field. "Gone before you could name it." "Well then," Phelps said, "you know what you are getting into." They drove north. The breaks were a series of eroded ravines cut into the chalky bluffs above the Platte River bottomland. The soil was thin and pale. Sage and rabbit brush grew in clumps between exposed shelves of limestone. No one had filed on this land because no one could farm it, and no one could farm it because there was no water on the surface and no topsoil worth plowing. But Elias had surveyed it. 8 years ago, chain in hand, he had walked these ravines and noted in his field book something he had told no one. In the deepest cut, where the limestone shelf broke and dropped 15 feet into a narrow canyon, there was a seep. Not a spring, a seep. Water that wept through the rock face so slowly it barely darkened the stone. But it was constant, and it was sweet. And in winter, it did not freeze because the rock held warmth from somewhere deep below. He also knew what lay at the bottom of the canyon, because he had been the one to note it in the county survey record, and then, on a private impulse he could not explain, scratched the entry out. There was a graveyard down there, not a proper graveyard. a scattering of limestone markers, hand-carved, dated from the 1840s. An earlier settlement, maybe a camp of overlanders who wintered badly and buried their dead in the only soft ground they could find, the silty floor of the canyon where the seep kept the earth from freezing solid. The markers had sunk and tilted over the decades. Some had slid into the creek bed during spring floods. By the time Elias surveyed the area, half of them were submerged in silt, and the names were barely legible. But they were legible. He had read every one. He had written them in his field book with the care of a man who understood that a name carved in stone is a kind of promise. They made camp on the canyon rim the first night. Nettie gathered sage for the fire, and the smoke smelled sharp and medicinal, like a room where someone is being healed or prepared for burial. Theo found a horned lizard and held it in his cupped hands and whispered to it. The sky went from copper to violet to black, and the stars came out with that ferocious prairie clarity that makes you feel both tiny and somehow accounted for. "Papa," Nettie said, "are we going to live in a hole?" Elias looked at the canyon below. In the dark he could hear the seep, a sound so faint it was less than a whisper. It was the sound of water remembering how to move. "We are going to live in a school," he said. She looked at him as if he had said they were going to live on the moon. The first week was brutal arithmetic. October in western Nebraska gives you maybe 4 weeks before the ground freezes hard enough to ring when you strike it. Elias had a wagon, 2 mules, a box of surveying tools, an axe, a saw, a hammer, 60 nails, and his 2 children. He had no lumber. He had no glass. He had no stove. What he had was stone. The canyon walls were layered limestone, the kind that splits clean along its bedding planes if you know where to set the chisel. And the sunken gravestones, the ones half buried in the creek silt, were the same stone, already shaped, already squared by hands, 40 years gone. Elias waded into the silty creek in water cold enough to make his bones ache, and began pulling them free. He handled them carefully. He read each name aloud as he lifted it. Thomas Wick, 1804 to 1843. Annalise Oster, 1821 to 1844. James Fenn, infant, 1843. He set them on the bank in a row, face up, and let Nettie copy the names and dates into his field book while he went back for more. There were 14 stones. He would need all of them, and more from the canyon wall, to build even a single room large enough to shelter 3 people and 2 mules through a Nebraska winter. The design was simple and borrowed from every sod house and dugout he had surveyed across the territory, but improved with the surveyor's eye for grade and drainage. He cut into the south-facing canyon wall at a slight upward angle, so water would drain out rather than pool inside. The back wall was living rock, which meant it held the Earth's warmth, 55 degrees year-round regardless of the air temperature above. The side walls he built up with limestone slabs, dry stacked and chinked with a mortar of creek mud, mixed with dried sage stems which bound as it dried and smelled like a church. The front wall facing the canyon he built from the gravestones. He set them names side inward. Nettie asked why. "Because those are people," he said, "not building material. Their names go inside where they are sheltered. They face the room, not the weather." The doorway he framed with 2 tall stones. The lintel was Thomas Wick. The threshold was Annalise Oster. He carved a channel in the threshold stone to keep rain from sheeting under the door, and as he carved he felt the ghost of another carver's chisel marks beneath his own, the man or woman who had cut Annalise's name 40 years before. The roof was the hardest part. He felled cottonwood poles from the creek bottom, laid them across the walls at 18-inch intervals, then layered sagebrush and creek mud and more sagebrush and more mud, until he had a roof 18 inches thick. It would leak in a hard rain until the mud set, but once it cured it would be waterproof and insulated, holding warmth like a wool blanket holds the heat of a sleeping body. For the floor he used packed clay from the creek bank, wetted and tamped until it was hard as tile. Nettie and Theo stamped it with their bare feet until Theo started laughing and could not stop, and the sound bounced off the stone walls and came back to them warm and round, and Elias realized it was the first time he had heard his son laugh since Ruth died. The CP channeled through a groove chiseled along the base of the back wall, directing it into a stone basin he had carved from a single block. Fresh water, year-round, inside the room. He knew of no house in Harlow that had running water indoors. The irony was bitter enough to taste. For heat he built a firebox of Stack's limestone with a flue channel running horizontally through the back wall before venting up through the canyon rim. The horizontal run meant the stone absorbed heat from the smoke before it escaped, and the back wall radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. The Swedes called it a kakkelugman. Elias called it common sense that somehow every American had forgotten. By the end of October the room was finished. It was 14 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for Elias to stand without stooping. The gravestones formed the front wall, their names facing inward, lit by the fire. Thomas Wick, Annalise Oster, James Fenn, infant, Catherine March, Solomon Burke, the names of the dead, sheltering the living. And then he did something that made Nettie stare. He took a piece of charcoal from the fire and drew a line across the top of the back wall, the living rock wall, and wrote the date. October 29, 1887. Below it he wrote 3 words. Croft Canyon School. Papa, Nettie said. There is nobody to teach. Not yet, he said. In the first week of November, Elias walked 12 miles to the nearest working post office and mailed 14 letters. Each one was addressed to the surname on a gravestone. He had spent 3 nights with his field book and the county land records he had copied years ago, cross-referencing the burial names with settlement records, land transfers, and census rolls. 8 of the 14 names had living descendants within 100 miles. Thomas Wick's granddaughter ran a boarding house in Grand Island. Solomon Burke's nephew was a printer in Kearney. Annalise Oster's great-niece taught piano in a church basement in Hastings. The letters said the same thing. Your family member is buried in a canyon in the breaks above the Platte. I have built a schoolhouse from the stones of that burial ground. The names face inward. Your family is sheltering my children. If you want to see the graves, you are welcome. If you want to send your children to learn, there is room. The first reply came on November 19th. It was from Solomon Burke's nephew, the printer. He did not send a child, he sent a crate of books. 42 volumes, some water-damaged, all legible. A note tucked inside read, Uncle Sol could not read. Maybe this evens something. The second reply came on November 22nd. Thomas Wick's granddaughter drove up from Grand Island with her 2 grandsons, ages 8 and 11, and enough salt pork and dried beans to feed 5 people for a month. She walked into the schoolhouse, saw her grandfather's name carved in the front wall, and stood there for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to Elias and said, You do right by these boys, and I will see you do not starve. By December 1st, there were 7 children in the schoolhouse. Elias taught them surveying, mathematics, reading, and penmanship. Nettie taught the younger ones their letters, using charcoal on flat stones. Theo appointed himself keeper of the water basin and guardian of a family of mice that lived in the wall chinking, which he fed crumbs and named after presidents. Word reached Harlow. Phelps heard that the surveyor he had exiled was running a school in a hole in the ground, teaching children with gravestones for walls. The story traveled the way stories do in small places, gaining barnacles of absurdity. He is teaching them necromancy. He is raising the dead. He has gone mad and is making children sleep among corpses. Phelps sent 2 men to investigate in mid-December. They rode back the same day and reported that the schoolhouse was warm, clean, well built, and that the children could do long division. Phelps said nothing. He folded the report and put it in his desk and did not mention it again. Then the blizzard came. It arrived on January 12, 1888. Later they would call it the school children's blizzard because of how many children it killed. Children who were in schoolhouses with thin walls and pot-belly stoves that died when the wind found the gaps. The morning was warm, unseasonably warm, 40 degrees above zero, and farmers sent their children to school in light coats. Teachers opened windows. Cattle wandered far from barns. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than 3 minutes. Elias felt it before he saw it. The barometric pressure changed so fast his ears popped. He walked to the doorway of the canyon schoolhouse and looked north and saw a wall of white descending from the sky like a curtain being drawn across the world. The air ahead of it was yellow-green, the color of bruised fruit. "Everyone inside," he said. "Now." He pulled the heavy stone slab across the doorway, the one he had cut to fit like a cork in a bottle. The children stared. Outside, the sound was like a freight train made of sand. In Harlow, the blizzard hit the wooden schoolhouse on Plum Street and tore the north wall off in a single gust. 23 children and their teacher, a young woman named Ada Prine, were exposed to 60-mile-an-hour winds and a wind chill that would later be calculated at 40 below zero. Ada Prine wrapped the smallest children in her skirt and the older children in every coat they had and led them across the street to the general store. But the general store's chimney blew down and the roof began to lift, and they had to move again to the livery stable, where they huddled in horse stalls and burned hay for warmth and prayed. 3 children died that night in Harlow. One was the son of Gerald Fry, who had helped carry Elias's smoked pork out of his root cellar 3 months before. In the canyon, the blizzard screamed overhead like something living and furious. Snow drove horizontally across the canyon mouth. The wind could not reach the schoolhouse. The stone walls held. The seeps still ran. The firebox still radiated heat from the morning's fire. The temperature inside stayed at 52 degrees. The 7 visiting children, and Nettie and Theo, sat on the packed clay floor while Elias read aloud from one of the printer's books, a water-damaged copy of Robinson Crusoe, and the candlelight moved across the carved names in the wall and made them seem to breathe. Thomas Wick, Annalise Oster, James Fenn, infant, the dead, sheltering the living. The blizzard lasted 18 hours. When it stopped, the silence was so total it had a sound, a high, thin ringing, like a glass held to the lip. Elias dug out the doorway. The canyon was filled with snow to a depth of 8 feet, but the schoolhouse entrance faced south and the overhang of the canyon wall had kept the drift to 3 feet at the door. He cleared it in an hour. The sky was blue and empty and so cold the air felt like breathing broken glass. He hitched the mules and drove to Harlow. The town looked like it had been shelled. Roofs torn away, windows blown in. The church steeple lay across Main Street like a fallen tree. Livestock frozen where they stood, cattle-shaped monuments of ice and hide. The survivors were gathered in the 2 buildings still standing, the stone bank and the brick courthouse. They had no water. The well pump had frozen and burst. Elias found Phelps in the courthouse. The assessor was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, wearing his overcoat and someone else's hat. His hands were wrapped in strips of blanket. The clean fingernails were blue. Elias set down a jug of water from the seat. It was still liquid, warmed by the rock. Phelps looked at it. Looked at Elias. "How?" he said. "The ground," Elias said. 55 degrees year-round. "I told you I mapped it." Something moved in Phelps's face. Not shame exactly. Recognition. the slow understanding that he had exiled the one man who knew how to read the land, and the land had answered. "You could let us freeze," Phelps said. "I could," Elias said. "But your children did not evict me." Over the next 3 days, Elias led 17 people to the canyon. Women, children, and Gerald Fry, who walked the 12 miles on frostbitten feet and carried his surviving daughter on his back. They filed into the schoolhouse and stood among the gravestones and felt the warmth of the earth rising through the walls. Gerald Fry looked at the carved names. He could not read well, but he traced the letters with his cracked fingers. "These are real people," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "And they are holding up the walls." "Yes." Gerald Fry nodded slowly. His eyes were wet, but his face was still, the way a man's face goes still when he understands something he cannot say. Nettie served broth made from dried beans and salt pork. Thomas Wick's great-great-grandsons sat next to Gerald Fry's daughter and taught her to play cat's cradle with a piece of twine. Theo introduced the newcomers to his mice, who were named Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, and who apparently had strong political opinions about crumbs. By February, Harlow had begun to rebuild, but the canyon school stayed open. More children came, some from Harlow, some from farms Elias had never surveyed. Parents who had heard the story brought their children and sometimes stayed to listen. Elias taught what he knew, which was surveying and mathematics and the reading of land, and Nettie taught what she was learning, which was everything else. And the books kept coming, sent by descendants of the names on the walls, people who had never met Elias but who understood that their dead were part of something that mattered. Phelps never apologized. That was not in him. But in April, when the ground thawed, he filed a new deed with the county clerk. The canyon and 40 acres surrounding it were granted in perpetuity to the Croft Canyon School District, a legal entity that had not existed 6 months before and now served more students than the Harlow Township School. Elias did not celebrate. He noted the filing in his field book beside the old survey entries and closed the book and set it on the shelf beside Robinson Crusoe and the 41 other volumes the printer had sent. On a morning in May, when the sage was blooming pale blue along the canyon rim and the creek ran clear over the silt, and the seep sang its faint constant song inside the schoolhouse wall, Nettie came to him with a question. "Papa," she said, "the names on the wall, are they still dead?" Elias looked at the front wall of the schoolhouse. The morning light came through the open doorway and fell across the carved letters. Thomas Wick, Annalise Oster, James Fenn, infant, Catherine March, Solomon Burke. The stone was warm to the touch, heated from inside by the earth and from outside by the sun. He thought about it for a long time. "Nettie," he said, "go ask Theo to feed the presidents. I need to sharpen the chisel." She left. He stood in the doorway. Outside, the 7 visiting children were climbing the canyon wall, finding footholds in the limestone shelves, calling to each other in voices that echoed off the stone and came back doubled, as if the canyon itself were answering. A red-tailed hawk turned the slow circle above the rim, riding a thermal that rose from the warming rock. Elias picked up the chisel. He walked to the front wall, to the empty space between Solomon Burke and Catherine March. He set the blade against the stone. He began to carve his wife's name.